Hello and welcome to episode 4 of CPCine, the Amstrad CPC Video Magazine. This month we're turning the clocks back to October 1984 to take another look at the early days of Amstrad's phenomenal home computer. Let's get started. In a month where Commodore has announced its new high-end machine, the CPM-compatible C128, the imminent arrival of CPM and disk drives to the CPC 464 is looking like it's just the right thing at just the right time to keep Amstrad in the home office and entry-level business environments. Popular Computing Weekly is calling time on most of the home computer models this month, declaring that prices are being pared back to the bone, with the exception of the BBC, most likely due to its continuing success in the educational market, which is essentially allowing Acorn to demand whatever price it wants for its machine because schools will have to pay it to stay compatible with the latest software. According to PCW Magazine, it is left in the low price range for Commodore and Sinclair to slug it out. Don't rule out Amstrad just yet, guys, especially since Sinclair's profits are taking a hammering. The most interesting piece of news to come out of the second issue of Amstrad's official magazine is that the people at Amstrad now have a decent idea of who their core market is at the start of the computer's life. Although many of us CPC lovers will come to see games as a major concern for our beloved machines, at the start of its life, games were a minority interest. The CPC didn't start out as a rival to the Commodore 64 or the Spectrum. It set its sights on competing directly with the BBC and other high-end machines. As many of us already know, the CPC was designed from the start to be equally at home in the office as well as the living room, and that's where it has already found a significant market share. It's quite telling that those registering their computers with Amstrad via the registration card scheme have made it clear to the company that they want more programming languages, development tools, and applications. Games are a low priority. According to ACU, most new CPC owners already have another computer at home. One apparently has 7 of them. And with a new system launching practically every week at the peak of the release boom, we can only wonder how many systems this person eventually ended up with, and which turned out to be their favourite. 464 User Magazine has also doubled in size, both in the number of pages and the size of those pages. It now has an actual magazine look rather than a flimsy pamphlet, which only goes to show how quickly the CPC has gained a following. Amstrad is still having trouble with the ICL minis, and now even the official magazine is wondering why the order processing department doesn't just use an Amstrad CPC. Apparently the editorial team was assured that the problem would be sorted out in time for 464 User Issue 2 to arrive on readers' doorsteps. Did it happen? We'll have to wait and see. The 464 has now gone down a storm after its launch in France. France would go on to become a major player in the CPC world, and when you see the reception the computer received after its launch, it's no wonder. CPC 464 User sums up why a computer that comes with its own monitor would be such a hit in France in just one sentence. They have to worry about multiple standards of television: PAL, CCAM, Peritel, 819 lines and 625 lines, so the plug-in and off you go argument is particularly pertinent. And it's a fair point. ITV have commissioned a magazine-style children's show on Thames Television. It's called CBTV, and the presenter recently toured the Personal Computer World show this year, where he and his teenage WizKid sidekicks decided on the computer to use in the show. Despite the market dominance of the Spectrum and C64, CBTV's computer of choice will be the Amstrad CPC 464. Good old Arnold pips the big boys to the prize. There's just one question though. Does anyone actually remember CBTV? At 4 years old, I was too young to be watching it, so I have no memories of the show, but perhaps some of our slightly older viewers can fill the rest of us in? Now, before we move on, let's just take a moment to admire the subtlety with which Amstrad Computer User hinted at the existence of a new Amstrad computer in this latest issue. In the second paragraph of their news feature, which was mostly about a computer show and how the CPC 464 had fared fairly well, especially after it was chosen to be the computer of choice for that CBTV show, they tell readers not to call the Amstrad CPC 464 the Amstrad. Why ever not, you may ask? Let's allow CPC User to explain with this delicious little line. If Amstrad were to be contemplating a further computer product, I'm not saying it is, but in case it were, what would that be called? I guess we'll just have to wait a couple of months for it to arrive, and then we'll find out. New releases are coming thick and fast this month, with educational titles starting us off. For those CPC users who are interested in learning something from their CPC, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say it's their parents who are most interested in learning something from their Amstrad, either way, we have Dragon, which I cannot find a copy of sadly, and Potluck, which I also cannot find a copy of. That's not a great start for software this month, but these things keep happening. The catalogues and archive efforts for the Amstrad have been great over the last few decades, but inevitably things will still slip through the cracks, especially at this early stage of the CPC's life. You've got to remember that at this point, the Amstrad computer only launched 4 months ago, and things in the CPC scene are still getting started. To help find these missing games and programs, I've created a central repository of all the known information about these titles on the CPC wiki. The link is in the description box below if you want to take a look and help try to rescue these lost programs. On the gaming side of things, early CPC users can enjoy Pontoon, which I can't find a copy of, although the Wacky user group will make a very nice version of this game in 1986. Matchmaker, another title I simply can't find. A fun cross between Pac-Man and Manic Miner in the form of ghouls, which we'll be taking a look at later in this episode. More adventure gaming goodness with a look at Arnold Goes to Somewhere Else, the sequel to The Trial of Arnold Blackwood, released just last month, and Trace Race, which was definitely released because there's an advert for it in 1985 and then a second advert later in 1985 for a double pack of Trace Race and Pulse Warrior. Sadly, no copies of either game are available online as far as I can find. It's also worth noting that Manic Miner is apparently now available on the CPC. It's very odd that this hasn't been discussed by the official magazine or even mentioned as a release title by Popular Computing Weekly in their weekly roundups of new software. However, issue 2 of CPC 464 Computing Magazine, which we'll be taking a look at later in this episode, mentions it, so apparently it's out by around October 1984. Something tells me that they saw an advert for it and thought it was already out when it's still due for release later in that year, but maybe I'm wrong on that. Let me know what you think in the comments section below. In the meantime, serious users can get their teeth stuck into Amstrad Assembler, another Z80 assembler, but this time it's from Mountsoft, and Font 464 from Highsoft. We also have a program that we somehow missed in earlier episodes. According to cassette magazine CPC 464 Computing, Kuma Computers launched their Zen assembler software as their first CPC title. We've already seen that the software from Kuma arrive on the CPC by October 1984, so Zen must have been a very early release. Sorry we missed you, Zen. With the release of Zen, Amstrad Assembler, and of course DevPack, which we took a look at in episode 3, the CPC is shaping up to be a powerhouse of assembly languages to code with. We'll have to take a proper look at the range of assemblers available in a future episode to decide which is best. Finally, there's also a utility that doesn't really fit into any other category. It's Amstradraw, a pools prediction program that Popular Computing Weekly described as a straight port of the ZX Spectrum's SpectraDraw. But unfortunately, neither SpectraDraw nor Amstradraw have copies available online. It appears to be completely missing in action. So that's it for the new releases for October 1984. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but then again, that was always the CPC in a nutshell. Something for everyone, no matter what your computing interests. Lovely. I'm going to come right out and say it. I love flight simulators. I wanted to be a pilot as a kid, but knew I couldn't pass the medical due to bad eyesight and failing hearing, so I made do with simulators to try to capture the love that I have for flying. None of them managed it until Microsoft Flight Simulator 5.1, a program that I saved up for months to buy, and which I still own a copy of now, along with several of its sequels. I won't be comparing FlightPath 737 to Microsoft Flight Simulator, however, as it would be a deeply unfair comparison. Nothing on the CPC can compete with the depth of detail that Microsoft series brought to flight simulators. We have to take the CPC's simulators as they come. It's the only fair way to do this. So let's get started. The music on the opening menu is surprisingly chirpy. I wasn't expecting a simulator to come with a theme song, and certainly not one this jolly, but it's pretty fun and I kinda like it. Well, I did the first few times I heard it, but it's very short and it keeps repeating, so you may want to turn the volume down. On the menu, we're given 6 options, each of them a particular difficulty setting for our flight. This changes the height of the mountain range that we'll be flying over and the length of the runway that we'll be landing on at the end of the flight. Yes, that's it, we have one particular flight simulated in this entire program. It's at this point that we see the limitations of the simulator, because it is always the same flight. Now, it's understandable given that the program has to fit into 64K of memory, but I can't help feeling just a bit disappointed in some respects. Anyway, let's select option 1 for the easiest flight since we've not flown this simulator before. This is where we meet our first problem. As with all flight simulators, you'll be tapping keys all over the keyboard in order to fly. Some of them will become second nature very quickly when you get into flight sims, but this one has a major problem right from the start. The manual tells you to press Alpha in order to begin taxiing on the runway. Do you see an Alpha key on the CPC's keyboard? I don't. I thought it might be a misprint, so I pressed the A key, and was immediately told that I'd crashed the plane by raising the landing gear. Okay, let's try again. Maybe it meant the at symbol. Nope. In fact, no key I pressed seemed to do anything at all. Well, except for F to change the angle of the wing flaps, and A to raise the landing gear and crash the plane into the tarmac. Lovely. Let's take another look at the manual. Oh, there's a page that translates the ridiculous Greek letter controls into what the controls actually are. Of course there is. It wants us to press 7 to start taxiing. Why couldn't it just say that? Why do I need a decoder ring to fly this aircraft? Oh, because they only printed one set of instructions and packaged it with every computer this program was published on. That's why. Great job, guys. Great job. If it sounds like I'm getting annoyed with this program, it's because I am. This is the first flight simulator on the CPC, and it's not very good. The controls are slow and don't work very well. I often oversteered and understeered when taxiing on the runway. The runway is ridiculously short, even on the easiest of modes, which makes taking off properly next to impossible, and there's no decent sense of flying, which is essential to a flight simulator. Oh, and it's written in Protected Basic, which explains a lot of the problems. All in all, I was expecting something interesting from this program, and I really wanted to enjoy it. It fought me at every stage, and in the end, I simply can't recommend it, not even out of curiosity's sake. There are better flight sims on the CPC, you should try one of those instead. Now let's leave flying alone and concentrate on the supernatural. This is Ghouls from Micropower. It's basically the answer to the question few people would ever ask. What if you crossed Manic Miner with Pac-Man? How does it fare? Let's take a look. That eye-straining graphical effect aside, the game looks pretty basic, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is mostly compiled basic with some machine code effects thrown in, to be honest with you. The sprites are small, the colour choices are garish, and the sound effects aren't great. The music is exactly what you would expect from a creepy setting, however, and I do like that. It's pretty good, even if the volume keeps changing for no discernible reason. But it's the gameplay that we're really here for, isn't it? If we wanted fancy graphics and sound, we'd go and play the latest games from the big name publishers. But we're here for classic gameplay. Does this game have some? Absolutely. You're supposed to collect the dots because you're Pac-Man with legs, and that's what Pac-Man does, and avoid the hazards. What are the hazards? Everything. Everything in this game will kill you. The obvious ghostly enemies? That thing that looks like a platform? That bit of red grass? Falling? Yes, falling a short way will kill you. Basically, everything that's not a platform or the background will cause your untimely demise. This game is hard. The controls are very responsive, but that's both a blessing and a curse. It's great that the game whizzes along at a decent pace, but the problem is that you'll have to make precision jumps, and the hyper response time on the controls makes that a real chore. It was damn hard getting over that red grass, let me tell you. In fact, it was strangely tricky to get up there in the first jump, because if you don't land perfectly, you go straight through the platform you were aiming for. Now remember that when you have to jump from further up the level, because one wrong move and you'll plummet to your death. For an early game in the CPC's range, this is a decent little platformer. I certainly spent a lot more time playing it than I expected to, and if you give it a try, despite its numerous problems, I think you'll like it too. This episode's type-in section is a head-to-head grudge match between Bomber clones. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Bomber is basically the end section of Harrier Attack, where you drop bombs on a city and wreak havoc. If that sounds like fun to you, you've come to the right place. Let's get stuck in with the type-ins. Bomber is a fairly simple game. You fire bomber aircraft over a city, and you have to bomb each building to smithereens. Some low buildings will take only one bomb to completely destroy, while higher buildings will take several. The amount of each building a bomb can take off seems to vary depending on its height, which adds a little bit of extra strategy to the game. Each time you pass over the city, you are flying a little lower, and you have to destroy all the buildings before you reach the bottom of the screen, otherwise it's game over. Crash into a building, and it's game over too, so you're gonna have to stay sharp. There's not a lot going on in the game code, to be honest, and as type-ins go, we've seen a lot of what it has to offer before, but I wanted to take a look at this one in particular because of its use of the symbol command in BASIC. If you look at line 30 of the listing, provided you can read it through ACU's god-awful layout choices, who in their right mind puts a graphic behind computer code anyway? Anyway, if you look at line 30, you will see the symbol command followed by a number, a comma, and a string of hexadecimal code. That code is telling the CPC which of the computer's library of symbols to redefine. Which symbol is it? The one that the number refers to. The code that follows that number is the layout of the new symbol. The symbol layout is defined row by row from the topmost to the bottommost. Symbols are 8 by 8 pixel squares, so the value of each row determines the contents of the block of 8 pixels. This can make defining a symbol a little bit of a headache if you aren't used to doing it, so a symbol defining program, like the one on the CPC 464's welcome tape, only with the actual ability to tell you the code for the symbol you're redefining, is a real help here. The symbol command is an oddity because not all symbols can be redefined straight away. Initially, you can only change the attributes of symbols numbered 240 to 255, in other words the last few of the entire set, unless the symbol after command is used to change this range. With symbol after, it's possible to completely rewrite the entire symbol library, including the alphanumeric symbols. But don't worry if that causes problems for you, because using the symbol after command again will reset all of the symbols to their factory defaults. For an excellent demonstration of how the alphanumeric symbols can be redefined, take a look at that pontoon game from Wacky that we discussed earlier. That game uses a custom font which is developed using the symbol command because the whole of that pontoon game is written in BASIC. All in all, Bomber is a fun little bomber game that takes very little effort to master. The scrolling is pretty decent, and it's not a bad way to kill 10 minutes here and there. For a short type-in, I was very impressed. So what's the other one like? Let's take a look. This is the star game in the 4th of October 1984 issue of Popular Computing Weekly, which is great because Popular Computing has only just started to cover the Amstrad CPC very recently. In fact, we did cover their first Amstrad type-in just the last episode, so it's come a long way very quickly. Originally calling itself Bomb Drop, as can be seen in the listing and in the game itself, the magazine calls this program Helicopter Fury. In this surprisingly long type-in, it comes in at 125 lines and a whopping 5K when saved on disk, which is pretty hefty for such an early type-in. It's actually double the one in ACU. You play as a lone helicopter pilot tasked with bombing the hell out of an entire city in order to prevent the launch of an experimental nuclear weapon. Heavy stuff. The game is colourful and runs really quickly for a game written entirely in BASIC, although perhaps that's because it is a single screen game with only a couple of moving sprites on it. The helicopter is a double-width graphic made from 2 custom characters defined using the symbol command, while the bomb is a single custom graphic. It looks like the explosion and the buildings also use custom characters, which is pretty nice. As you can see, the game is almost exactly the same as Bomber from Amstrad CPC 464 User Magazine. The only differences are the graphics and the scrolling, which is not as good here as it was in the previous game. Here, the aircraft has been replaced by a helicopter, and the buildings have windows in them. That's the only real difference. Oh, and Bomber allows you to set the speed you want to play at, but that's neither here nor there if we're honest with ourselves. Overall, this is a pretty decent little game that doesn't do anything immensely groundbreaking in terms of basic code, but it is fun nevertheless. I had a bit of fun with it, although I will admit it kept crashing the emulator that I typed it into, which is a big surprise. I was only able to bomb 2 buildings before the machine would lock up on me and I had to restart. If anyone has managed to find out why this happens, I would love to hear from you, because I held back this episode of the show in order to try to fix the code, but I couldn't for the life of me work out what was going on. I think it has something to do with the bomb dropping mechanic, because it keeps crashing while I was attempting to bomb a building, but I can't be sure. A disk file with both this game and Bomber on it are available from my website if you fancy giving these games a try. The link is in the description box. When it comes to Pascal, the Amstrad CPC was not short of options. 3 Pascal suites came straight to mind for the CPC, the first being Highsoft's Pascal 4T, which we mentioned getting a release a few episodes ago and which may also go under the name Amsoft Pascal in some circles. Highsoft also released their wonderful CPM-based and far more standards compliant Pascal 80. Then there's Turbo Pascal from Borland, for those of you who want some Pascal but want it Turbo? It's a smaller version of Borland's Pascal coupled with a compiler to make your program super quick, and it's CPM based. Speaking of CPM, the fact that the CPC is CPM compatible means it has access to all the other CPM based Pascal programs. So if you want to delve further into this nifty programming language, your options are very wide. For this part of the video, we'll be sticking to the programs released specifically for the CPC, otherwise we'll be here all day. So what is Pascal? Well, in essence, it's a structured programming language from the 70s that's very fast, very efficient, especially for the time, and which has influenced a wide variety of modern programming languages, including Delphi, which I remember trying out on Windows back in the 90s, and Java, which is now in use on pretty much everything. That's not bad for a language that essentially came along because its inventor wasn't allowed to make the changes that they wanted to make to the ALGOL programming language back in the 60s. Pascal was another attempt to make a programming language that could be easily ported between different computers with different hardware. Like BASIC, which would come along later, Pascal used human-readable instructions that required a compiler before they could be run by the computer. Unlike BASIC, however, Pascal took its compiler ideas from assembly language rather than compiling the code line by line as the program was being run. Early adverts for Pascal on the CPC claimed Pascal offered the speeds of assembler with the ease of coding of BASIC. That's a nice marketing line, but does it ring true when you get down to using it? Assembler is faster. BASIC is easier to understand. Pascal is quick and relatively easy to get to grips with, but in home computing terms, you're unlikely to find it worth using unless you really don't want to deal with one of the other 2 options. Or unless you've already learnt it, of course. Despite seemingly having no real reason to exist in comparison to the other 2 offerings, Pascal still found a lot of interest in the CPC market. Certainly enough that Highsoft alone was able to bring out 2 Pascal products, and that still left room for Borland to bring us a 3rd. So, let's take a look at them. Pascal 4T launched around September of 1984, making it the first Pascal product released for the CPC. Initially retailing on cassette, the later disc version would simply be called Highsoft Pascal. When you first run Pascal 4T, you'll find yourself looking at a program that looks very much like DevPack, which we took a look at in episode 3, and there's a good reason for the similarity. Highsoft have a simple look and feel that works well for their programming languages, and when you switch between them, you instantly feel at home despite the change in language. This helps newcomers get to grips with their software straight away. The manual that comes with Pascal 4T is just as comprehensive as the one for DevPack too. It gets you straight into coding in Pascal, and although I don't understand the language myself, I was soon up and running writing code in this new language. Coding is simple, and it's a very nice touch, like with DevPack, for the software to generate the line numbers for you. Editing lines is also very simple. You can simply retype the line if you include the line number at the editor prompt, just as you can in BASIC. That is useful for people like me, as I tend to forget that Pascal needs to end each line with a semicolon, so being able to go back and put that in before the compiler complains at me is very useful. Compiling programs is lightning fast, just as it was with DevPack. Again, like with DevPack, running compiled code can be done from inside the software, which makes compiling for a quick check of a routine very easy. The compiled code is very quick, not as quick as it would be if compiled in assembler, but actually not that noticeably different. And overall, I felt this was a very nice implementation of Pascal on the CPC. So what can Pascal 80 bring us that Pascal 4T couldn't? Well, in short, CP/M compatibility. Welcome to the world of true cross-format programming. Also, welcome to the world of having to deal with CP/M command line horribleness. If you enjoy faffing about with 70s operating systems, CP/M is lovely, I suppose. But for everyone else, there's a reason we ditched DOS in favour of Windows, and it's readily apparent the moment you have to handle the command line. Pascal 80 isn't anywhere near as neat and compact a package as 4T, but it's not supposed to be. Pascal 80 is for people who are already at home writing in Pascal and who have their own preferred editor to write in, although it does come packaged with one which is similar to the one that DevPack 80 comes with. You can even write your Pascal programs in Amstrad if you want to, and then save them to disk to be compiled in Pascal 80. It's bigger, it's more comprehensive, it has far more customizability, and better compatibility with a range of Pascal programs available already via CP/M than Pascal 4T does. However, it also has a major downside compared to the earlier program, for me at least. The editor and the compiler are separate programs. Now, okay, I can understand why this is the case. It allows for more memory to be available to the coder because the Pascal program is, obviously, smaller in size. But I have to admit, I like the ease of use of being able to drop into the software, write a bit of code, test run it, and then drop back into the editor to correct any issues without having to quit the software and load another program. Maybe that's just me, but it is an issue and I have to highlight it. Altogether, Pascal 80 is a larger and more complex version of Pascal that's clearly designed for more serious users, such as college or university students and coders. Its CP/M basis allows for more flexibility in terms of passing code between machines, but it has its downsides too, most notably the split between editor and compiler, although I will admit there are advantages to that as well, as I mentioned before. I'm not as keen on Pascal 80, but then again I'm not a Pascal person, and at the end of the day, this really is a case of different software for different needs. Finally, we have Turbo Pascal from Borland. As with Pascal 80, this is a CP/M program, so you're going to need your CP/M disks handy if you want to run it from original hardware. Unless of course you have a good disk image handy and access to a floppy emulator, such as the DDI3 or the Flopper from Zaxxon, and we'll have more about those in a later episode. Once it's up and running, Turbo Pascal is a very simple program to get to grips with. Like Pascal 80, Turbo Pascal has a built-in editor that's comprehensive, if a little slow here and there, but it can also load in Pascal code written in other editors. Either CP/M or Amstrad programs will work as long as the file is saved in plain text. This is great for anyone who has a program that they know their way around and who wants to get to grips with a bit of coding very quickly. Turbo Pascal compiles software really quickly, as you would expect. I had no problems getting to grips with the software once I'd taken the time to find my way around the built-in editor, which has the usual keyboard command quirks that come with any keyboard-only editing program. Oh, how I miss my mouse and menus when I'm getting to grips with this stuff. But it's not that hard to learn the commands, and once you get used to them, coding is really quick. Compiling is smooth, just as it was with the other Pascal titles, and I think there's nothing at all to fault with this software. The manual is comprehensive, and the colour scheme is decent, so you don't have to risk eye strain while working. That's always a bonus. Overall, the CPC has a very nice range of options for Pascal coders, and I really can't fault any of them. The CP/M offerings have the added advantages that come with being both based in CP/M and thus allowing cross-platform compatibility, and also offering the option of loading in software from any editor going, which allows for far more flexibility. However, Pascal 4T should not be overlooked. It's on cassette and disk, so all CPCs can use it, and despite being a very early entrant to the CPC, it's still a comprehensive language with a lot of cool features for coders to get to grips with. As I said earlier, I really can't fault any of these packages. They are great implementations of Pascal, and each has its advantages. Pick the one that's right for you, and you'll have no problems with it. There have been many disk-based magazines for the CPC range, usually accompanied by demos or public domain software once those scenes got themselves established. But it's interesting to note that the CPC had a cassette-based magazine almost from the start. we didn't cover it earlier in the show because, to be honest, I only recently discovered it, and it seems that I'm not alone. So let's remedy this oversight right away by taking a look at CPC 464 Computing, a cassette magazine from Argus Press Software. It's not possible to date the issues of CPC 464 Computing precisely because the cassettes don't have their month of issue on them, although issue 1 of the magazine does refer to its cover date, albeit without actually saying what that cover date is. But we can work out that issue 1's news section was definitely written very early in the CPC's life. We know this because of two things. It discusses the recent sales figures of the CPC, and they are very low, around the 50,000 units sold mark, and it mentions Roland in the Caves as a new title, with high hopes for the second, soon-to-be released, Roland on the Ropes. I found this a very interesting revelation, because up until now, I'd always seen Caves and Ropes as launch titles. This magazine suggests Roland on the Ropes came out after Roland in the Caves, rather than at the same time, i.e. either at the launch of the CPC or very close to it. It's therefore a very interesting read. So, based on this news, we can assume a writing date for the news section of somewhere around June or July of 1984. We don't know the release date of the magazine, however, but the later parts of the news section mention receipt of issue 1 of Amstrad CPC 464 User, the official magazine of the Amstrad CPC User Club. Based on that note, CPC 464 Computing can't have launched before August of 1984 or late September at the very earliest, since that's when issue 1 of 464 User was published. Given that the cassettes wouldn't have taken that long to run through a professional duplicator, the lead time for the magazine would be comparable to that of a standard publisher, i.e. we can probably expect the magazine to have been completed and sent off for publication around a week or so before it went out to readers. That's based on my own background in publishing, which is admittedly from a 21st century perspective, but if I'm wrong on these timings, I'd be happy to read any of your corrections in the comments section. The magazine is bi-monthly, so if we assume the magazine launched in late August, we can expect to see issue 2 by October of 1984, the month that we are covering in this episode. The timing for this is backed up by a mention in issue 2 of the release of Flight Path 737, the flight simulator from Anirog that we discussed earlier on in this episode, plus the arrival of DK-Tronic's speech synthesizer. CPC 464 User Magazine reviewed Flight Path 737 in their October 84 issue as well, and we mentioned its release back in episode 2, which covered August 1984, so it seems the timing is all out of whack back at the start of the CPC magazine reviews. Clearly there is too much software available for the computer already for anyone to be able to keep up with it all. However, there is one major indicator that issue 2 was not released in October 1984, and that's a statement in that issue's news section that Amstrad disk interfaces are now available. We know from the official magazine that the disk drive would not arrive until November 1984, which suggests that once again we are seeing long writing times for the news section of each issue. So on the face of it, this news section appears to have been starting in or around October 1984, but was being updated into November of 1984, which gives a release date of somewhere in the middle of November. On that basis, and assuming that they managed to keep their bi-monthly production schedule, that puts issue 1's release somewhere around September of 1984, but here's where it becomes even more interesting. CPC 464 Computing issue 2 mentions the appointment of Simon Rockman as editor of CPC 464 User Magazine. Simon took over in issue 3, the January 1985 issue, which would have been in production around December of 1984. That further cements the second issue of the cassette magazine being released sometime in November, in my view at least. However, Paul Kemp of the Amstrad CPC 464 Facebook group has a few copies of this cassette magazine in his collection, and one of them actually has a date on it. Issue 5 is marked as July 1985, which by my calculation is 1 month ahead of the dates that I've worked out so far. The end result of all this is that either the magazine slipped a month at some point, or they stuck to their original bi-monthly schedule and issue 1 launched in October 1984. If anyone can be more accurate than this, I would love to hear from you. CPC 464 Computing is a very technical magazine, far more so than even CPC 464 User. In issue 1, the magazine goes into depth on the memory management abilities of the 464, even discussing which memory addresses can be called to pass parameters around, and how to use the OUT command to achieve screen scrolling, albeit in 16-byte jumps. If you're into the technical side of things, this can be a really interesting read. I certainly found it fascinating. Further into issue 1 is a funny piece about shadow characters and a design flaw in the CPC 464 that can cause unrelated characters to be generated by the machine if 3 keys are held down at the same time. Why anyone would be doing that outside of Ctrl-Shift-Escape to cause a soft reset is beyond me, but apparently if you hold down 3 keys at once, it can cause the machine to register a 4th and completely separate key press. How the magazine expected anyone to test this out, outside of jotting down a note and trying it out later, is beyond me. That's one of the major problems of a cassette or disc magazine. You can't have it open, on screen, and still try out the things it's discussing for yourself. You have to shut the magazine down in order to use your computer for something else. In that respect, we've really come a long way with our computers, because now we can have multiple programs running at once, and this lack of ability when using an electronic magazine really hits home how useful multitasking is. As a final point on the CPC 464 computing, they have a section of the magazine called Amstrad Action. It's their review section for both the technical and the game side of things, and I think that's going to become a bit of a problem next year. I'm pretty sure you all know why. All in all, CPC 464 computing is an interesting little piece of CPC history. As electronic magazines go, it's not the best ever, printing to the screen is painfully slow, and having to load each of the magazine sections one after the other is tedious. But some of the technical information is really nicely written, and the overall feel of the magazine is decent. It's written in a conversational style, and the presentation is pretty good for such an early piece of software. Presentation styles would change regularly with CPC 464 computing. Each issue increased in style and complexity, both in presentation and the behind-the-scenes coding. Issue 1 is pretty simple, with each section written in BASIC and the on-screen style being very limited. But from issue 2 onward, machine code starts creeping in, although that does unfortunately have the consequence of knocking out the disk commands, because of where in the CPC's memory the magazine loads its machine code. As we covered in episode 2, this memory allocation problem cropped up in the most unexpected of places when the disk interface was introduced, even though Amstrad specifically states in the CPC 464 manual not to use certain addresses because they were reserved for future disk expansion. So I guess more people than just me didn't read the manual back in the 80s. While I was copying the early issues of the magazine to disk format for the CPC wiki, I found this machine code address issue quite aggravating. So thank you ever so much to the wonderful Amstos on the CPC wiki for working out how to adjust the memory addresses so that the software will still load properly, but the CPC isn't hampered in the process. Speaking of the software, it's interesting and varied. Issue 1 contains a simple editor program which is really useful in 2 ways. First of all, it allows you to edit 4 characters at once, which is really useful for all those times when you want to make a double-sized sprite. And secondly, it actually shows you what the code for that symbol is. This should have been part of the symbol editor on the 464 welcome tape, and wasn't. Oh well, at least it's here now. But it's not all serious software. The games on side 2 of the cassette are usually not all that deep, but they are fun and they do work, which is a big advantage. On the first cassette, the games are a racing endurance race that's basically Star Dodger, the typing game from Amstrad Action that I keep referring back to, because it's a lot of fun and only required about 15 lines of code to work, which is much shorter than this game. This one takes up a fair amount of memory. The other game is, well, it's another Bomber clone, and I'm not joking. What is it with magazines in October of 1984 and Bomber clones? It's weird. I have to admit that I wouldn't come back to some of the games on these cassettes more than once, but I'm glad I've had a chance to give them a try, and hey, they weren't all that bad to be honest. Overall, CPC 464 computing is one to give a look at if you're interested in the early days of the CPC. There are some good points as well as bad, but in my view at least, the good points of this overlooked gem far outweigh the downsides, so give it a check out. There's a lot to be said for making games that are simple but fun, and Cyber Chicken is a prime example of that. At its core, it's a simple turret game, like you've probably seen many times before. The plot is simple, as is the gameplay. You control a turret in space, and you have to shoot down a load of chickens in spacesuits before they reach their destination. The quicker you do it, the bigger your skull bonus at the end of the game. But the simplicity masks the fun of the game. It's really easy to control. It sounds great when you fire and the chickens are shot down. The chickens look great, the sprites are colourful, and they scale really well as they progress across the play area. everything is polished and feels very responsive. There's a fair amount of slowdown when there are a lot of chickens and a lot of the turret fire on the screen, which makes the invading swarm a little bit harder to shoot down, but aside from that, and let's face it, handling dozens of sprites on the screen at once has always been the CPC's Achilles heel, so the slowdown had to be expected. So aside from that, the game is brilliant fun and well worth checking out. It's not a game that you'll keep coming back to unless you're a big fan of turret shooters, but what's here is an excellent example of the genre, and I really quite like it. This game was released just as I was finishing up the script for this episode, but it's so cool looking and sounds so good that I just had to review it here and now. Written by Christophe Petit and Kulkan, with additional contributions from some of the most famous names working at Amstrad Gaming right now, Shadows of Sergoth is a new adventure game in the traditional pseudo 3D style of Eye of the Beholder or The Bard's Tale. The game has amazing polish to it, with everything from the superb menus to the way the game just flows as you play it, making the game experience immensely satisfying. Shadows is a big game. It's split over two sides of a 3-inch disc and requires 128k of RAM just to run, but it's easy to see where all of that memory is being used. Movement is in steps, in the usual style that every pseudo 3D game from Sultan's Maze onward has used, but each step is rendered super quickly. I've been playing games like this for decades, and I was shocked at how fast this one was. In fact, as I was playing it, I was thinking about how the engine here could be used and tweaked to make this work as a Wolfenstein 3D port. Yeah, it's just that fast and that good. So what's the plot of the game? It's your standard fantasy fare. The kingdom of Chrysandia has been at war for many years, but is now trying to heal itself. Everyone has forgotten the harshness of the war and the evil that terrorized the land, including you. But now, you are hearing stories in a local tavern of children and cattle going missing, never to be seen again. So you went investigating, and found out that the government of the kingdom doesn't want to do anything about the situation, so it's up to you to sort the mess out. In a standard dungeon crawler game loop, you begin with next to nothing to help you, and you find equipment as you play. The early puzzles and monsters are simple enough to sort out, which is great, and you'll quickly find yourself carrying enough items to keep you going, which is also great. The game is remarkably simple to get into, and deep enough to keep you going for a long time. The game is not without its faults, but all of them are due to the nature of what's being attempted here. Sometimes, sprites of items on the ground will disappear as you're moving around the game world. This is a problem caused by how the game is rendering itself, I'm sure. Items are visible when face on or viewed from behind, but if you're looking at them sideways, which can happen more often than you would think, there's a very good chance that they won't be rendered at all. As a result, I sometimes had to check rooms twice in case I'd missed an item. It's a small issue, but when you're looking for certain things to deal with certain puzzles, it becomes a bit of a problem. The other issue is that it's not really clear at first how the combat works. Is it turn-based, or is it in real time? Well, it turns out it's a bit of both. The enemies only move and attack when you move or attack, so you could sit there and do nothing, or go off and make a cup of tea, safe in the knowledge that you won't get killed while you're away from your keyboard. On the other hand, if you make a wrong move, or try to attack before the enemy is in range, they will get a free shot on you. Make enough errors of judgment like that, and it's game over. Fair enough, I suppose, but even on the lowest difficulty, some of these enemies can creep up on you, so just bear that one in mind. When I first loaded Shadows of Sergoth up, I didn't expect to be playing for quite as long as I was. This is the kind of game that I loved in the early days of my PC gaming life, and I'm very happy to be able to return to this kind of game on my Amstrad. The game looks like an early 90s PC game, and sounds like a game that you would find on the Atari ST. I can't get enough of this brilliant soundtrack. Quite frankly, I'm amazed at this gem. It's clearly a modern classic, and if you haven't played it yet, I recommend you grab your favourite emulator or your favourite CPC SD card reader and download it today. You will not be disappointed. Well, unless you're trying to play it on a standard CPC 464 anyway. The game is designed for the CPC 6128, so you're going to need 128k of RAM and a disk drive. If you don't have those, grab an emulator, because you really shouldn't miss out on this one. Well, that's all we got time for this episode. I hope you didn't mind the wait too much. From now on, I think we're going to stick to one episode per month, which will allow me to go far more in-depth on topics compared to what I could do on a fortnightly schedule. We'll see how it goes for a few episodes, and then make a decision on how to progress from there. So, until next month, happy computing CPC lovers!